It's Tuesday, August 27th, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Mr. Jeff DiSantis. He is the founder of 2020 Insight, LLC, which offers survey research and consulting to candidates for public office. Prior to going into business for himself, Jeff was the executive director of the Georgia Democratic Party from 2003 until 2007, where he served under party chairman Bobby Kahn. Before that, he was a staffer and spokesman for Georgia Attorney General Thurber Baker. He earned his law degree from Emory University Law School in 1994, but more importantly, he completed his undergraduate work here at the University of Georgia back in 1991. Thank you very much, Jeff, for taking this afternoon to talk history and politics. So I wonder if we begin, tell me a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
Yeah, I was born in Chicago. Family moved around. My dad was in the Army in South Carolina, a physician, ended up practicing here with a guy that he met in the Army. So we moved here from actually Cleveland, Ohio, of all places, and ended up staying here other than a couple stints in Washington, D.C. in the 90s and early 2000s. As you mentioned, went to undergrad and law school here in Georgia. Kind of got more into politics right out of the gate than legal practice. It's more fun than practicing law. I do a little bit of legal practice now on campaign finance, that type of thing, but a lot more political consulting.
So how did you get interested in politics as somebody who moved around quite a bit? What drew you to politics? Because so often politics is local.
I mean, I lived most of my life here, but just interested in it.
Okay.
Beginning at the university here, was one of the rare 1988 campaign volunteers for Michael Dukakis. Was not a big favorite of the UGA student body at the time, but went up to D.C. to be an intern for Sam Nunn in '91 in his press office. Worked for Ben Jones briefly, congressman who was on the Dukes of Hazzard.
That's right, Cooter.
Then went to law school and then actually went back to D.C. After being an intern for a Nunn committee, not the Armed Services Committee, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Went back up to look for a job right as the Democrats lost control of Congress, which was probably not the best time to be looking for a job as a Democrat in Washington, since they lost Congress for the first time since Eisenhower. But ended up working on the '96 Clinton campaign, the re-elect. It was first paid campaign gig. I went to the Democratic National Committee after that and worked on the now long forgotten damage control of the Asian foreign money scandal, if you remember that. It kind
Chinagate?
Yes, it kind of got buried a bit by Monica Lewinsky, which came after that.
There have been other more substantive scandals since then.
Yes, it's a little quaint at this point. But,
so what were you doing in '96 for the re-elect? Where were you stationed?
I was working for an environmental group in Washington and volunteering at the headquarters, and then I got sent to Pennsylvania. I actually tried to come back here.
Pennsylvania, of all places.
But didn't land anything with the Clinton campaign here, and they ended up not targeting Georgia. They had targeted it in '92, and they started it with it in '96, but pulled the plug like in August, I think, and sent the money to Florida, but ended up in Pennsylvania, which was supposed to be a target, but ended up not being much of a target.
Right.
They ended up, it ended up getting a little boring because that was actually a fairly easy re-elect.
Well, and I don't even think there was any other statewide major. I don't think anybody in the Senate was up in '96.
Well, Cleveland got elected that year here.
Right, here,
Yeah.
but not up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
so
no, Pennsylvania, they thought it would be sort of the turning point for Dole versus Clinton, and it ended up being a fairly easy win for Clinton.
Right.
The entire race was,
right,
which meant
exactly.
the swing states were.
So tell me how you go from the re-elect to the DNC. How'd you get hooked up with the DNC?
I knew the attorneys who were inside the DNC who were working, obviously, on sort of damage control around this story, which kind of broke in the last couple of weeks of the general election campaign. It was John Wong and was Indonesia, and there's these other stories about money coming into the DNC that was not legal or appropriate, and they were trying to. We basically went there. They hired some of the people off the campaign to go there and kind of push the money out the door before the press found it, and then set up a system to make sure it didn't happen again. So
Do you know if that system's still in place?
I think it actually
something
is.
similar to it.
I think it actually is. At least last time I heard, they were still doing that. But it was a system that that's everybody who gives over a certain amount, or anybody who comes in contact with the president, or I guess in this case it'd be presidential candidate since there's not an incumbent president, that type of thing from the political side.
Sure.
And then I did that and ended up meeting some people that hooked me up with a consultant who was doing a governor's race down here, which is how I ended up back here in '98.
And that would be Jim Andrews?
Yeah.
Also
Andrews,
from Chicago.
Yes.
I believe.
Andrews had been Zell Miller's campaign manager for his gubernatorial reelection campaign in '94, which was a very tough race.
Yes.
He had a candidate. He was actually doing Pierre Howard, who was running and then had gotten out of the race. And Lewis Massey, who was sort of Howard's protege, got in. And he was doing Massey.
Okay.
And I was working there. The guy who was the research director of the DNC at the time, who I worked with on some of the projects that, I was working on there, he knew Andrews from that '94 race. And through that and a couple other connections, ended up hooked together and getting hired to be Massey's research director. So I moved back down here in '98 to do that.
And Massey, of course, loses.
Right. Well, we got into the runoff.
To Roy Barnes.
We got on the runoff with Barnes, and then he pulled the plug.
Right. Which was like the day after.
Right. Which we were way behind. I mean, my guess is we would have been an underdog.
Sure.
Probably could. It would have tightened, despite the nature of those things. We probably would have had a hard time raising money, but I think there was a lot of institutional pressure on Massey because at that point the Democratic Party knew that things were dicey.
And Massey had been the Secretary of State?
He'd been appointed Secretary of State by Miller to replace
Right.
Cleveland because Cleveland had to resign to run.
That's right.
To run for the Senate in '96. He got replaced. He got
The
appointed.
The Billy Lovett rule.
Right. Beat like David Schaefer, actually, in the general election.
That's right.
And then, I think earlier than planned, this ended up running in the top of the ballot race. And, it was a good candidate. I mean, I think it was just Barnes had really, the establishment had migrated to Barnes largely, not entirely, but largely had migrated there.
Sure. So how do you make the transition from Massey's campaign to Thurber Baker's?
Well, Baker had been appointed by Miller as well.
Right.
And Andrews was helping him, and Miller's consultants were helping Baker.
Okay.
It was sort of a Miller project.
So does it
try
go
to get him elected?
Does it go Bowers, Baker?
Right. Bowers resigned to run for governor.
Okay.
And Miller appointed Baker, who
Okay.
was his floor leader in the House.
That's right.
Was a House member from DeKalb County, and had a great record. Sponsored the Hope Scholarship legislation, 2 strikes, taking the sales tax off of groceries, all sorts of sort of Miller signature items.
Right.
It was seen as a bit of a long shot at the time he was appointed. Miller had also tried to do a similar thing with a guy named Al Scott, who got appointed. He's now the Savannah Commission chair, Chatham Commission chair. And he lost a primary to David Poitras for labor commissioner after being appointed. So Baker was appointed in '97 when Bowers resigned to run for governor, ran for a full term in '98. I moved over there in July of '98 because the primary, I think, was in July at that point.
Right.
So moved over there in late July as campaign manager. First race I ran. He was a good candidate. I mean, he did a really good job. It was obviously a decent year to run as a Democrat. '98 turned out to be a pretty good year based on
Right. Historically, it wouldn't have been
you would have thought
year.
it would be bad. And it was hard to tell what was going to happen because that's when the Clinton impeachment was happening, and it was sort of hard to tell how that would play. But generally speaking, I would say the Republicans overplayed their hand on that. That's the year Edwards won in North Carolina, Hodges won in South Carolina, Barnes won here, Sigelman won in Alabama, who was also an Andrews client. That was a good year to run in the South as a Democrat. So it that was helpful. We also had a couple of things break our way. David Ralston,
A familiar name.
Yes, who's now the speaker, was a state senator who was a Republican nominee. I think was probably a good opponent for us. He wasn't a prosecutor. Had some ethical issues that we were able to use as fodder. It was a good race. Baker also ended up having a high-profile matter that we didn't know how it would play at the time, but
and that was
it was Ralph David Abernathy III's prosecution for corruption, and it was hard to tell how that would play, but he didn't have much choice, but he did the right thing and did his job, and I think got some credit from the public for standing up and doing his job even when he was getting some criticism,
right,
what have you. So I think it helped him.
So and then from there you came on staff in the Justice Department?
I went to I guess they call it the Law Department.
The Law Department.
So, Justice Department would be a better name, but they call it the Law Department. And went there and was there from 98 to 2000. And then I took a leave of absence from there to work for Miller's Senate race. Coverdale died.
So what was your role at the Law Department?
Communications director, kind of senior counselor. I tell people it was sort of a great job because it was sort of like Law and Order. It didn't have to do a lot of brief writing, but got to sit around and opine about the great issues of the day and talk to the press. So, it was a fun part of sort of practicing law in that environment. It was fun, and Baker's a great guy and a good boss. So it was a good time.
So that leave of absence, Coverdale passes away. I think he had his stroke like the July 19th.
Yeah.
Passes away maybe the 21st of July. So that's a short window for a campaign. When did you come on board to Miller's
I went over there in
campaign?
August of 2000.
Okay.
And it was sort of an odd thing because we heard that they were thinking about that Barnes was going to offer it to Miller. I think most people thought Miller wouldn't take it.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been governor, etc. It was obvious that it had to be offered. It's less obvious that he would say yes. He did say yes,
Mm-hmm.
but it was sort of interesting in the interim there where he was trying to figure out what was going on. And you had, at that point, the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, and the labor commissioner were all Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
All would run statewide, top of the ballot at some point. And I think we're all sort of, and several of them were, 3 out of the 4 at least for sure, were sort of direct Miller proteges. So they're all sort of waiting to find out. And they're not going to say anything while Miller's there, but they're all
Sure.
sort of on pins and needles about whether they're going to have a chance to be a U.S. senator. What Governor Barnes would have done had Miller said no is unclear, but he did say yes. And then I ended up taking a leave from the Law Department to go over and be the research director
So
that race.
The Republicans didn't have a candidate until the national convention when Mack Mattingly emerges as sort of. There had been some discussion of how the AirTran value jet guy,
Right.
Jordan maybe says that sound right.
Right.
But the Republican establishment coalesces around Mack Mattingly.
Right. Well, it was funny. I think it was Nathan Deal had a quote in the paper because he was in Congress at the time where they had some meeting. It may have been at their convention, and some reporter asked him, and at that point he said, "Yeah, we're all trying to figure out who gets voted off the island, basically, because I think most of them thought Miller wasn't beatable," which he really wasn't, based on the amount of money they had and whatnot, and the time. I actually do think that race is a little dicier than people thought underneath.
Really?
If you look at the polling. Yeah.
The conventional wisdom is,
he rolled.
Yeah.
And he did. He ended up getting 58. He won a bunch of counties that, Democrats hadn't won in a long time. He had a lot of, obvious political power based on his gubernatorial record. That said, I think our biggest concern was there was a history of kind of popular Democratic governors running in conservative states for the Senate and not winning. Like Ben Nelson, who eventually got in the Senate, had just run in '96 and lost.
Right.
To Hagel, and that was sort of the one we were thinking about, where it's we love you as governor, but as Senate seat is a different calculation since it's a legislative body.
Sort of like Republicans up north.
Right.
Elect,
Right.
Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan.
Right. It's a standalone job. And
Gotcha.
then, when you go to Washington, you're part of a caucus, and it's who's in the majority and what have you, and people make a different calculus. Plus, the issues are obviously different. So that was sort of our concern, but we ended up, doing fine. I mean, I think had we ended up in a runoff, since it was a special, you had a ton of people on the ballot. The Florida recount was going on, and that would have been a sort of a dicey proposition, I think, had we ended up in a runoff, just because the Bush versus Gore thing would have been sort of above it, like a cloud kind of thing, and I think that might not have been good for us.
Did you target your campaign or run your campaign differently, knowing that a former Senator Mack Mattingly was sort of the key opposition, or was it simply run the campaign as quickly as possible because you only have 3 months to do this?
I mean, it was a little bit of both. I mean, we did end up having to do some negative advertising, and Mattingly's record in the Senate was obviously a big part of that.
Okay.
He, had some votes that had gotten him beaten in '86, and particularly on agriculture issues and what have you. And I remember we went on a fly around and queued up Tommy Irvin to talk about that, which was about why Mattingly had been voted out of office in '86, and there had been particular votes he'd taken sort of in the David Stockman sort of Reagan era, sort of free market era that did not play well in places that depend on the Farm Bill, that type of thing. But I mean, and he'd taken some votes on Social Security, that type of thing too. So we ended up having a record.
Okay.
To contrast with, which we did. I mean, it was obviously a short campaign, but over the course of October, we ended up doing some negative advertising. They did some too, the RNC and what have you. I remember they had this ad that they made Miller sort of look out of proportion with this big head. And they took his '92 convention speech and some interview done about how much he liked Hillary Clinton at the convention and played that. And it hurt us. I mean, you definitely saw it in the tracking. But in the end, it was not enough, obviously.
The rationale I always heard from the Democratic side, the Republican side, on why Mattingly, as opposed to somebody different, was it was an attempt to hold the margin down for Democrats, to allow Bush to carry the state over Gore, instead of letting Gore pick up something of a Miller coattail effect. What do you think? What do you think about that rationale? Is that
maybe? I mean, I'm not sure Mattingly necessarily is necessarily even the best for that. I do know, the Gore people looked at Georgia, they polled it, and I think they actually won on the air in Savannah, is my recollection, and we're sort of testing things out a little bit.
It was only 5 points, I think, if I'm remembering correctly.
And they kind of nibbled around the edges. Then everything kind of ended up in Florida at the end there, which became the vortex of everything, which my then girlfriend, later wife, was actually running for Gore at the time, but that became sort of the center of the universe.
Well, in that case, they probably should have ran in Valdosta, gone on air in Valdosta, maybe picked up some of the votes.
I actually do think, if you look back at the southern tier where they have Tallahassee TV and what have you, where Gore and Bush were on. I mean, the Democrats did not do as well there, I think, because that was going on. But anyway, it was a relatively easy election.
Right.
The last one for Democrats statewide in a while. So. Right.
So you were on a leave of absence. Did you go? You said you didn't go back to
No, I went back to Law Department for a couple months, and I ended up going to D.C. with Miller for February of '01. Stayed there for about a year.
What was your job up in his office?
Assistant.
Okay.
So did several issues.
Was Charlie Harmon the chief of staff?
He had been the initial. It was actually Alex Albert.
Ah, that's right. Yeah.
At the time. So, and Joan Kirshner, who now works for Isaacson, was, I think, the press secretary. She'd been on the campaign as well.
Right.
So, And, obviously he, cut a relatively conservative path. When I was there, he actually had a couple issues that I worked on with him. One, he was a Democrat with the Democrats on McCain-Feingold. He was with the Democrats on like Patients' Bill of Rights, which was a big issue then. And a couple other issues. He actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that I helped him with some research on, sort of talking about why he was for the Bush tax cut, harkening back to Lyndon Johnson State of the Union, where he announced a tax cut in Medicare and Medicaid in the same same State of the Union. Theory being, if you want to spend a bunch of money on programs, you have to show people that you're not just about taking their money and spending it on programs. You got to cut taxes at the same time. So it was like in June, I think, of 2001, I think is when he put that in the New York Times.
Okay.
So
you weren't on staff very, very long.
No, I stayed there a year.
Okay.
I mean, some of it was just, the Senate's a relatively slow pace, and the other was...
It's slower these days.
Way slower, yeah. The other part was obviously, Miller, which we talked about, was sort of cutting a different path than yours truly was sort of part of, which is fine. He's the one who got he won the election. He had every right to
sure
pick where he wants to go.
But you chose to come back to Georgia.
I went to work directly for Andrews, and I came back. I worked out of Atlanta. The only client I had that cycle here was Baker's reelect.
Okay, so you weren't involved in the Barnes campaign with Bobby,
not,
or okay?
I was not. I mean, we knew what was up based on the
sure
polling that we were doing, and it was obvious that people were a little on edge.
Was there a coordinated campaign at all in 2002 here?
Yeah, there was.
Okay.
There was. I mean, when you're at AG, you don't have a huge role in that.
Right.
And Barnes was raising so much money that there wasn't really a lot of
You
pressure.
just get on the bus with everybody.
There wasn't a lot of pressure to put money into the pot or anything the way there might be if you didn't have an incumbent governor who's raising that kind of money.
Right.
I mean, it was unbelievable the amount of money they raised.
So we know Baker won re-elect. Who was his opponent in 2002?
It was one named Shannon Gessling, who later she was a prosecutor in Cobb, and then she later became head of the Southeastern Legal Foundation.
Okay.
A conservative legal interest group.
Phil Kent's old.
Yeah, he may have worked there. I think she's actually got a nomination from Trump for a particular job. I'm not sure what.
I'm pretty sure Ben Blackburn, if you remember that name, was a president of Southeastern Legal, and he was Georgia's Republican congressman from the 4th district from '67 until Watergate riffed him out.
Beat him, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So what was your reaction? Where were you at election night 2002?
We had a little room at the Hyatt. I actually was in Atlanta.
Okay.
Just because Baker was here, and we had sort of a little side room at the Hyatt, and it was a kind of a strange evening. Obviously,
I bet.
Yeah, Barnes, and then one of Andrew's other clients was Don Siegelman, who
was that the Fob James?
No, it was when he lost to Riley,
and
it was like a 5,000 vote swing in Baldwin County. It looked like he had won by 2,500 votes, and then Baldwin County, Alabama said, no, actually.
There were some questions about
yes, there were some questions. It was odd, and that entire election was odd. And the Barnes thing was a shocker. I mean, we were in the ballroom when he gave a concession speech, and it was not a life highlight.
I take it you were surprised. You had seen the polling, but you were still surprised.
I thought, it would be close, but I didn't think he'd lose. Once we saw some of the margins and some of the outlying kinds, I remember Ware in particular stands out. He got 2/3 of the vote there in '98, and I think he got a third in 2002. I mean, he just had that's an example. I mean, it's a complete inversion of the vote, and he did better in, I think, suburban Atlanta than he
was not popular in the Okefenokee country.
No, and that was, it was. I mean, obviously we were relieved that Baker had won pretty comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
Taylor came close to it was closer. I mean, he ended up getting like 51.5, and Cox and Baker ended up being in pretty decent shape, although it didn't really have that year particularly strong opposition.
Right, Cox. But is that what you attribute their success to, as opposed to the top of the ticket, quality
maybe.
of candidates? Or?
Maybe some of it, obviously, yes. I mean, it can be hard to beat a down ballot incumbent, particularly once they've had time to establish themselves and get some press. But some of it, I think, Barnes had some particular record points as governor that I think, he would tell you to, caught up with them politically.
The flag, the teachers, the Northern Arc.
Right. And the flag change was a major
you think that was
cultural
probably the
shift in, sort of it sort of outside of Metro Atlanta. I think it really, it changed people's sort of cultural identity. Partisan
places like Ware County,
right,
rural Georgia.
Right. It was the right thing to do, but it changed the political dynamic completely.
Sure. So how long until you came on staff at the Democratic Party of Georgia?
That was like early. I mean, it was like January, February of '03.
So that's a pretty quick. How did that come about? How did that?
I mean, I think I probably ended up over there because I wasn't a Baker, or I'm sorry, I wasn't a Taylor or a Cox person. I was a Baker person. At that point, Taylor and Cox were already rivals, I think.
Oh, that's right, for 06.
And that's probably why it happened. I mean, I went on vacation with my then wife and came back and had a job. So it was sort of my recollection of what happened. And went over there, and it was like literally, frozen in time. Like, there were still papers all over the desks from the campaign and that type of thing. So it was sort of starting over completely.
So did you start before Bobby became?
Yeah, Calvin Smyre was the chair for about the first year I was there.
So you actually bridged the two, Calvin Smyre and Bobby.
Was still there. He'd been there. And then Bobby, I think.
And Bobby didn't hold it against you for being a Lewis Massey guy?
No, we kind of, I'll tell you how we sort of bonded was the Senate, at the end of the 03 session, the Senate had not confirmed the Democratic Party's designee to the election board. They just didn't do it. And the Republicans had put Randy Evans on there, who was obviously now ambassador to Luxembourg, as a combative, aggressive guy. And I had some conversations with some of the people in the Secretary of State's office and some other places about, getting a counterweight to that. And I called Bobby and I was like, what do you think about being on the election board? And that was sort of our, when we ended up kind of becoming friends. Friendly was when, I called him about that because we needed somebody to be aggressive.
Did he go? Did he end up going on the?
He
election
went on the
board?
election board. He would never have gotten confirmed, but then he would have had to resign anyway because he became party chair.
Right.
So, but that's how that happened.
So tell me about the state of the Democratic organization that you said you walked into a place frozen in time. What was the actual organizational structure and the health of that structure in 03?
Well, I mean, I think it was particularly difficult as a transition because the governor had traditionally run the party as an adjunct of the governor's office. I mean, the interesting thing about it was we ended up we did a task force to rewrite the bylaws. And they actually had it where you picked a new chair in like September of election year, which I think was sort of a vestige of when the Democratic runoff was tantamount to election, and then the new incoming governor would put his person in charge. And the same thing with the caucuses. We ended up opening kind of an operation for the two legislative caucuses inside the party where they could raise money into the party and know that it would be spent on legislative races that they wanted it to be spent on. And I think they were getting out of the mindset that the governor would fund that. I think previously had been, because Murphy lost also at the same time.
That's right, Bill Heath.
Right. So you ended up with a massive transition. The Senate was like in a little better shape, even though they lost the majority on switchers. The Democrats still had the majority, but the Senate had they still had Taylor, who was there to kind of
Right.
organizing focus, and he actually, very much to our gratitude, really picked the ball up on funding the party. I mean, there's a bunch of debt, and he raised tons of money to pay that debt off and keep the doors open. He really took it on to really turn that thing into, a functional organization again.
Did you notice, speaking of financials, did you notice a drop off from traditional funders from, say, the business establishment?
There definitely was.
There was.
I mean, it ended up not being quite as dramatic as we thought. I remember, we were like, are we going to have a JJ dinner kind of thing?
Right.
And it turned out to be reasonably good. Some of Taylor and Cox and Baker helped. And the House did some too. But, obviously the sort of monopoly and a lot of the lobbyists who had, made their living on connections to the Democratic establishment were rapidly currying favor with the Republicans, which, is not surprising, but
right.
It made it harder to get the business community to, write those checks that you need to sort of fund day-to-day party operations.
Do you think the state of the party organization for the Democrats, that the Democrats have been a victim of their generations of success?
I think, yeah. I mean, it was
there was no real party. There was no there when the governor was gone.
Yeah, I think that's true in the sense that it wasn't entirely that, and I'm sure it had started to develop somewhat. It was obvious there was two-party competition, but until you lose, it was a machine,
right.
basically, system. And I remember going to a meeting after Coleman, because when I got there, Coleman was running for speaker, and Larry Walker was actually the guy who ended up trying to do a coalition speaker.
Right.
So our first project was actually trying to help Coleman sort of hold on to the unified kind of Democratic speakership, which he did for at least 2 years. And I remember going to a meeting there, and it was, generationally and sort of ideologically and even partisan-wise obvious that, this was not a organization that was sort of used to two-party competition. It was much more of almost a nonpartisan system where everybody sort of ran in this, entity that, spanned the gamut from very liberal metro people to extremely conservative rural people. And there wasn't a huge amount of ideological interest binding them together. It had been sort of this is how we do it. And
right.
If you want to be elected and have any power, you got to be a Democrat. And it didn't really matter what your...
There had never really been any realignment along those ideological poles
and
because...
it was coming, obviously.
Right.
But and on some of those people switched. Some retired, some passed away.
Sure.
But it was obvious that was sort of where things were headed at the time. And I've said to some people, when people used to say rebuilding the Democratic Party, in some ways at that point you're sort of building it from scratch because it really doesn't have a ton of overlap with the previous regime. I mean, it wasn't possible at that point to put it back together even if you wanted to. We're going to have this sort of monopolistic giant tent that anybody who wants to run for office is going to think they got to be in this.
While the Republican Party in Georgia had been building an actual party organization for many, not always succafully, but they had been doing that work that you and Calvin Smyrie and Bobby Kahn had to do right after a major defeat.
And we had some meetings with the legislative leadership. We had to be like, look, guys, there is no, you guys are the party now. If you want to have money to spend on legislative races, you're going to have to raise it.
And these were conversations with Mark Taylor, Terry Coleman.
Yeah, those guys. Those and they were, and they would have conversations with legislators and say, the sort of top down, as long as you're in the club, there's a big pot of money waiting for you to run your campaign. That's over with. That will not be coming back. And
Right.
You got to raise money yourself now, basically.
And what were the 04 would have been your first cycle as executive director. What were you hoping to get out of 04? Sort of a stop the bleeding, just waiting, because you weren't really sure what to expect,
we weren't
I guess.
Sure. I mean, the DLCC, I mean, the Barnes maps were still there.
Right. The infamous Barnes maps.
Right. And, the Senate, even though we didn't have the Senate, was a good enough map that the DLCC, Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, sent people down. Like, we had a guy come in who was sort of an expert caucus guy. And, and we ended up, with a fair amount of funding. And then the maps ended up getting tossed in March of-ish, I think, shortly before qualifying, in February, March of 04.
The Larios case?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And, that was chaos, obviously. You have the 3-judge panel redrawing the maps. And I remember it was sort of interesting in the sense that the caucus are going to submit a brief. Each of them were going to submit a brief after the first draft came out of how they wanted it changed. And it was obvious that some of these guys didn't understand. Like, we're not drawing maps, guys. Like, we're just trying to tell the judge, like, hey, here's a couple tweaks you can make that'll make it a little bit better. Like, we can't go in and, redo your district because it's always been that way. Like, that's not an argument that a 3-judge federal panel is going to entertain. So we went in and tried to do a few tweaks, but, I mean, it was pretty minimal. They unpaired some incumbents, that type of thing. But it was not a good map for us, particularly with, Bush and Kerry. Was not a good matchup in the South.
So once those maps are gone, basically, there goes the House.
But, I mean, we knew it was going to be tough. We knew it was going to be tough. I mean, it's always hard to tell how incumbent versus non-incumbent plays, but it was going to be tough. And but it was clearly an uphill climb at that point. And the Senate, we ended up, beating several Republican incumbents because they ended up getting tougher seats too, but there just weren't, 29 seats in that map for the Democrats. So it was a climb.
Right. So what I've always found interesting is going through 02 and 04, you get to 06 and your statewide Democratic incumbents actually win and hold on. Thurber Baker, Michael Thurman reelected.
Yeah, Urban, I think also. And Baker, actually, I was at the party, but I ended up sort of spending a lot, fair amount of time on Baker as well. And Baker had Perry McGuire, who ran television and had been a state senator and general counsel at Chick-fil-A. It was, a real opponent. And, we were concerned enough that we, ran.
Well, a completely different environment than when you ran
completely
in
different
98
environment,
and
different
02.
kind of opponent. I mean, or his 02 opponent had not ever thought about purchasing a television ad, and McGuire was a self-funder, among other topics, other angles that he had to sort of make himself a legitimate contender. So we were concerned about that. It was a good year to be an incumbent. Another big focus, obviously, governor was a focus, not a good environment, but, we also spent a lot of time on Marshall and Barrow because they had redrawn the congressional map. Because Barrow in 04 had been one of the only Democrats to beat an incumbent Republican. It was him and a woman named Melissa Bean in Illinois, but that seat had been drawn for a Democrat. And then, what's his name? Max Burns had beaten Champ Walker in that general election in 02. And then Barrow, who was on the Athens Clark Commission, ran in 04 and beat
Max Burns.
And then Burns was running again, and Marshall drew Mack Collins, who had run for Senate in 04.
Right.
And then they redrew a seat that was supposed to favor Collins. So they both had these really tough races. And that was when the Democrats nationally were making a giant push to take the House.
And Marshall had the Macon-based seat.
Yeah, the 8th.
Yeah.
And he'd been mayor of Macon when he got elected in 02. So 04 was a big, or 06, excuse me, was a big congressional angle. I mean, we spent a fair amount of time on those, and the DCCC and other enterprises spent a lot of money on those seats, and that was a big. That was sort of the big priorities. The House and Senate, I think, unfortunately, we did what we could, but it was clear that the majority wasn't in the offing in either, based on the way the maps were laying at that point.
Do you think with Barrow and Marshall, do you think that sort of congressional wave election obviously benefited them holding those seats, but you didn't see much of an effect redounding to a Mark Taylor, for example? Like Mark Taylor lost pretty badly to Sonny Perdue during his reelect. What gives?
I mean, I think it was a couple things. One, I think, atmospherically, it was actually a pretty good time to be an incumbent outside of the federal circumstances. I mean, the economy is really good, but I do think the Taylor Cox primary was very damaging. I mean, I think, it got very personal. The two of them clearly don't like each other. There wasn't a lot of holding back in the primary round, and I think both of them ended up.
It's a crude term, but the so-called murder-suicide primary.
A little bit. I mean, we ended up getting a poll that somebody that funded through the party, what some of the unions funded about Perdue in early mid 05, and I think it was clear that he was not in particularly bad shape. I mean, I think when people are shocked like that, it's like it's a fluke. And Perdue got off to a little bit of a bad start. I mean, he came out for a big tax increase and just got murdered by some of the national Republicans.
Reneged on the flag referendum.
Yeah, that was out there, although it was kind of hard for us to talk about. But yes, that was out there. He came out for a big tax increase. There were some other things that he'd done that we, thought maybe give us an opening. Ethically, we ended up with a fairly what was played as a major story about sort of land dealings and tax dealings and things, self-dealing that he had done as governor. But I think that stuff was, you got to sort of be in a zone where people are ready to listen to that. And I remember doing the party paid for a focus group in the fall. Harrison Hickman did in Metro Atlanta, September-ish of 06. And it was just to be sort of non-aligned, kind of toss-up, voters. And I remember some of the comments they were making. It was just like, these people are not.
Where it was just, everybody does this.
Well, one guy in particular said, and these are not Republicans.
Sure. Right.
It was, my friends give me stock tips. If he's not doing it on government time, what do I care? And it was, and there was a sense that and I think it can be hard to be incumbent governors in a state like this where people are moving and they feel good about living there, and the economy is usually better than it is most places. You got an uphill climb, but it was clear at that point that Perdue was in pretty good shape. But I think it was unfortunate. I mean, Taylor's an excellent public servant. He had a really good record as LG. A different time, different race, might have been a different circumstance. And look, in hindsight, I think anybody advising the two of them would be probably saying the winner of this contest would be the one who decides not to run and runs for re-election and runs for some other office at some future point. Well, it's because Perdue wasn't, by the time we got there, was not particularly vulnerable.
Well, looking back in hindsight, could either of those candidates, do you think, would Kathy Cox have been a stronger or been able to do?
It's hard to see either of them beating him.
Sure, that's what I'm trying to ask more directly.
Yeah, some of it is sort of the partisan circumstances of the state at the time. Some of it's the atmosphere. I think I remember looking back, and I think only one incumbent governor lost in 06. It was a guy in Maryland who was a Republican who had managed to. Ehrlich, who had managed to get snared in all sorts of scandals involving abusing government employees, which in Maryland is not.
Was that when O'Malley
O'Malley
came in.
Yeah. And, so it was a tough time to run against an incumbent governor, but I think, also the partisan sort of circumstance of the state at the time was tough.
Even Rod Blagojevich in Illinois won re-election.
Yes. Yeah, but it was a tough cycle for
Right.
that. We were happy about Barrow and Marshall, but
Sure.
but it was tougher on the other front.
So did you stick around to make the transition from Bobby Kahn to Jane Kidd?
Briefly, I made I was like,
You at least cleaned your desk off.
yeah,
Huh?
and I at that point I'd been through a couple years longer than I thought I would do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was ready to turn the reins over.
So did you always plan to, after leaving the ED position, to go into business, or
I guess
how did
so.
that happen? How does that happen?
A couple guys I work with there, and I just we went and said, hey, we like doing this. I started doing this kind of research and general consulting. Our first client was actually had a campaign based here. It was a guy named James Marlowe who ran for Congress and. When Charlie Norwood died, tough uphill battle, but he was a friend of mine and good guy, and we did that, and we actually ended up doing the '07 Mississippi governor's race against Haley Barbour, which we also knew was a climb, but it was fun. We did got a lot of national stories written about Barbour's record as governor.
Good learning experience.
Yeah, and Mississippi's a cool place to do a race. So.
Were there any groups or people doing general campaign consulting in Georgia I know there were some on the Republican side doing it here.
Not many. I mean, it was definitely a little bit of a wasn't the most fertile ground for Democratic consulting at that point. And we ended up doing a lot of stuff. We ended up doing working in the Washington State governor's race and congressional race in Oregon. I mean, we did stuff all over the place just because there wasn't a lot to do here, to be frank.
Have you beat Dino Rossi too?
Yes. In 2008, we worked on the 2008 Gregoire campaign.
You guys should get shirts or have a club.
Yes. No, he's. I guess is he running again? I know he's running for. He most recently ran for Congress, but.
Yeah, he lost. Was that the Washington 3rd?
Yeah.
A doctor. He ran against a medical doctor.
That's right. I remember that.
But Inslee's running for re-election, so.
Yeah. Well, we apparently our Dino Rossi book has been floating around. DSCC had a copy.
It's clearly worked.
Yeah, well, it's Washington State. I remember telling somebody we're in the middle of that thing. It's like running for governor of Decatur. Like it's sort of a completely different change of mindset. Like the people who the issues that you talk about and where people are coming from is completely different than the South.
Right. Well, I mean that's a good question. How do you, for somebody who is so involved in politics in a formerly, although competitive, a formerly one-party state in the Deep South, how do you mentally shift gears to run races in Mississippi, which had been Republican long before Georgia, or Washington, which is completely different?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the interesting thing about, when I got into campaigns here, the Democrats are still in power, but, sort of the Guy Milner era, and everybody sort of felt like it was, going to switch at any moment. It's probably why Massey, I think, was pressured to and got out of that runoff. Is there was just a feeling that we didn't have any margin for error anymore.
Right.
And at some point, the world was going to catch up with us.
And it did.
And it did. And so you were running two-party competitive general elections, even if the Democrats kept winning.
Right.
Milner, as you know, came very close to being elected governor and senator, less so in '98, but came very close. And there was Bowers had been looked at as a very powerful potential nominee until his particular issues arose in that race. I mean, it was sort of strange. Everybody thought it was going to be Pierre Howard versus Mike Bowers, and it ended up being Barnes versus Milner. But it was, so you had some, but you definitely have to change how you think about issues in the sense, because, at that point in the South, I think less so now in Georgia, in some of the races I've done lately, but, social issues, don't talk about social issues. Talk about economic populism, that type of thing.
Right.
But, if you're doing a Washington State governor's race, choice.
Social issues benefit
Social
you as
issues
a
are
Democratic
all positives.
campaigner.
It's stuff that you would just, instinctively say no. And I had done some other races in Pennsylvania
Right.
a few times, and that actually tended to be even more sort of like the South at that point, because a lot of the Democrats are pro-life.
Yeah, the Caseys.
Yeah, Casey was one of Andrew's clients, and it's just very, very, very pro-life Democratic Party. Probably a majority, certainly west of Harrisburg. So you have a circumstance where you sort of get used to thinking that's not the zone you want to be in, but when you're in a place like Washington State or suburban Portland or some of these other, Colorado, there's a different ballgame.
So were you working as consultants or managers and what's the difference?
Managers tend to vary in what they do.
Right.
And they tend to, my experience with managers, having been one several times as well as worked with them, is they tend to sort of gravitate towards the stuff they know the best, and then they'll hire or delegate around to other people things they know less well.
Right.
And so for my case, communications, research, that type of thing tends to be where I end up, either as a consultant or a manager.
Right.
Field, that type of thing is not my expertise. Don't claim that it is, but a lot of campaign managers come out of that world. But manager ultimately too is a lot of it's just mundane stuff. It's
the day-to-day.
It's human resources for an entity that tends to be staffed by relatively young people, very bright and ambitious, but relatively young. So you have to do a lot of, this is how you act in a meeting. This is the time you have to get to the office. You don't talk to people like that, et cetera. You end up doing a lot of mentoring, might be the word, nice word for it, with folks,
Sure.
And a lot of it's just, where's the candidate going to be? Do we have the money to make the next TV buy and the payroll? If not, can we get it? Whereas, consulting is more some particular zone of the campaign, and or research, communications, and the polling side tend to obviously be the message and what you're saying and who you're saying it to.
So were you doing your own polling, or did you contract out polling?
Usually contract out. A guy named Chris Hubman and I started doing polling. The way we got into it was in 10. In the general, we had some clients that really couldn't afford tracking, so we sort of figured out how to cut out the middleman and start, hiring out, whether it be robo or live calls, ways to do it much cheaper than, the markup.
Right.
And so then we started kind of doing it ourselves, for folks. And we've done it for a variety of clients around the country, sometimes as a sub to bigger polling firms. That's the 2020 Insight piece, which is part of what I do. But,
right.
We've done a fair amount of stuff in Georgia, including a lot of legislative races recently, because if you can do it cost effectively, you can give people data that they otherwise would never have access to, because
right.
State Senate candidate's not going to pay for a $30,000 base poll and 2 tracks.
Right, and UGA and Monmouth aren't going to ask
right
about the state Senate or state House
right. They're
race.
going to do statewide stuff.
Right.
So and a lot of it's sort of issue shaping, communication shaping, which you can do fairly effectively. We've actually started doing a lot of online panels and that type of thing.
Right.
Which can be very effective in the sense that it's hard to get people to answer the phone, period.
Right.
Whether you're giving them a robocall or a live call, how many people do you know under 50 who ever answer a call they don't know what the number is? Answer is almost zero.
Right. I was interviewing Trey Hood, who runs UGA's polling operation, and phone banks, just trying to get people to answer
Response
the
rates
phone.
have dropped way down.
Right.
Well, and the theory of polling is that the people that pick the phone up, people that pick the phone up and are willing to answer the questions in total are not substantially statistically any different than the people who don't answer the phone, don't get
right.
called. That is a representative sample. and I don't think that's true anymore. So we've actually ended up doing a lot of phone calls to older people and then Facebook recruiting to younger people. This
is jumping ahead, but 2018, correct me if I'm wrong, was actually a relatively good year for pollsters. So on the one hand, we have all these challenges that you and I have talked about for polling, but polling is still pretty reliable.
It can be. I mean, obviously,
there are different firms that are more trustworthy and accurate than others.
I mean, the educated guesswork in any polling is modeling the electorate,
right?
And saying, okay, this is what we think the age makeup will be, the racial makeup, the gender, etc. That's always going to be involve some looking at history, making some judgments based on how things look in the data itself.
And you think maybe that's where the strength from 2018 came?
Yeah,
was it more predictable electorate?
I think some of it was people were super engaged.
Sure.
So it's probably easy to get responses. The flip side to it was also nationally, everybody was so amped up on politics that, I think there was probably less variation in the various groups that might have shown up or not shown up. But it's but pollsters are clearly going to have to do something to get response rates up and get more representative respondents.
Right.
Because you end up with these respondent groups that are very old, and it's very hard to get somebody under 35 on the telephone, and you get a few of them, and then if you overweight them too much, you very much risk
right
accuracy.
So, jumping back in time, 2010 was Thurber Baker's gubernatorial campaign your first statewide election in Georgia that you had worked since starting Insight?
Yeah, I guess it was.
Okay.
Yeah, and
was that a sentimental?
It wasn't. I mean, I think had Barnes not run, I think he would have been nominee.
Sure.
I think our problem in that was mostly financial. I think we sort of gauged that we would be able to raise what he'd raised for the primary, what he'd raised in his AG race 4 years prior, which was about 3.25.
But with Governor Barnes in the race.
Yeah, and Barnes, I mean, I think we, in hindsight, probably underestimated the sort of sentimental pull with some justification that Barnes had on the Democratic electorate. I mean, I think there was a sense he won before, so he could do it again. He's an effective politician, and I think they also felt, understandably, that he was owed another shot after how he had lost in 2002 and why he had lost. And I think it was just it was uphill. And
sure.
We kind of recognized that, and I think the Attorney General decided to stay in, which I completely support. But we made sure we ran a race that was not particularly, we weren't going scorched earth to try to take the guy down.
Right.
So
the Governor Barnes, I think he wins without a runoff.
Yes, he did. He did. I mean, we thought if we could force a runoff, there might be a little bit of a different tack. When Thurber got in, it wasn't clear that Barnes was definitely going to run, and we got in first and tried to raise some money, hoping we'd end up with without Barnes in the race. And then it became clear that Barnes was the establishment that's where they were, and in a primary that matters. So.
Well, and obviously Governor Barnes lost. Could any Democrat have won that election in that environment?
It's hard to say.
It's not a fair question. I know.
It's hard. And 10 and 14 were tough years,
right?
And it's hard to say. But I'd say you can't look at it and say if he'd done this or done that, or we had a different candidate that that person's a 50+1 on election day. I think that's a hard argument to make.
And do you think that the national environment in 2010 that accounts for this is a total wipeout of Democrats in Georgia? No more statewide elected Democratic.
So it has a big
officials.
part of it. I mean, I think, occasionally you have people running against the tide. Jim Hood, who's running for Mississippi governor this time, has managed to stick around. Had Baker run for re-election, could he have won? Maybe. Incumbent AGs with a reasonably good record, and
Right.
you can build a profile, or, Thurmond may have been able to stick around. But, in an open seat, you're going to have a tough time.
Right. So you mentioned 2014 as another difficult cycle, but that opened up very hopefully in Georgia with Jason Carter running for governor, and you worked for Michelle Nunn's.
Nunn's manager, yes.
So, how did you get involved in that campaign?
Well, I'd worked for Senator Nunn a long time ago,
Right.
and knew a fair number of people in that world.
Gordon Giffen, I think, was
Giffen,
chairman.
He was the chair of the
Yeah.
campaign, and I knew Gordon a little bit at that point, not real well, but
Right.
I had certainly knew him.
Ambassador
somewhat.
Giffen.
Ambassador, yeah. He'd been ambassador to Canada and
Right.
Clinton and what have you. Keith Mason, who worked with him, and I knew each other from Clinton era activity, but. Yeah, so they had a manager, I think, that the DSCC had recommended. Typical sort of model of younger guy, consultants, and I think in some races that doesn't work that well, and I think the Nunn family, the size of the race, all that type of thing, I think that just wasn't the right fit.
Right.
And a guy who I'd worked with, who was an Andrews guy, Jay Hauser, who worked for Saul Shore, called me. He was sort of doing it temporarily and wanted to know if I was interested in doing it, and it wasn't something that I was sort of looking to do, but was hard to say no, and was honored to do it. And it was a good race. I mean, Michelle turned into a really good candidate, especially for somebody who never run before. And did very well in the debates, raised a lot of money, was really good in the television ads. It was, as you said, 14 was tough. I mean, it opened kind of, to your point, I remember Ted Cruz shut the government down, and there was a sort of sense of
green eggs and ham.
This could run counter to the sort of normal cycle of 6-year presidential midterms being tough for the presidential party. But, you had healthcare.gov and just the general sort of atmospherics around politics, the end of the Obama administration, that type of thing was,
right.
It was not where we wanted it to be.
One of the things I remember, and one of the things that will always come up when you Google or you read about the race was the leak.
Oh, yeah.
The memo.
Yes.
How bad did that hurt?
It's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, it sort of threw us off our game. We were kind of
right. Obviously, you wouldn't want that.
Right. We were feeling kind of in a groove at that point. It was definitely, we spent a fair amount of time dealing with it.
Right.
The flip side to it is, I think it may have actually, and I've mentioned to other people, it may have actually encouraged Purdue to go a little bit too far. They ran a spot using the memo as justification, essentially accusing Michelle and points of light of funding terrorists. And
oh, right, yeah.
And we did a counter spot of her to the camera that I thought was actually a really good spot for her, because she basically was like, "This is outrageous," and I think that actually was maybe the best spot for us in the entire race, because how she looked, how she delivered it, that type of thing. I thought she was really, really good. So it's hard to say. It certainly threw things off a little bit. Certainly when we got the call from National Review about the memo, we were like, wait, what? She had actually called the reporter actually called our pollster who was in the memo. And it was unclear as to where it had come from, but it was not obviously a good day, but
You've had better.
Yeah, that said, I think it probably didn't cut particularly against us that much in the end. I think it was sort of a wash.
The Republican primary was an extremely hard-fought one, a runoff too.
Right.
Which I'm sure you were watching,
Right.
just as closely as your own campaign, because who you were going to be running against. Did you have? Were you hoping one candidate or the other was going to come out of that?
There was a split opinion on that.
Okay.
Inside the campaign, I actually was of the opinion that, sort of high risk, high reward was David Perdue, in the sense that, he clearly was a highly talented candidate, had really good people working for him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was obvious. It was interesting because D.C. was very focused on Kingston.
Right.
To some extent, Handel, I think, because she'd run before.
That's right, in the 2010.
And he got in, and I remember, people in Georgia were telling them, Perdue's got people that ran Sonny Perdue's campaigns. I mean, these people know how to run a statewide race. He's got his own money. And then he had that sort of launch video. It was Fred Davis special with the, crying babies in it. And I think people at that point realized, like, okay, this is serious. But I remember sort of redeploying researchers and suggesting that DSCC do the same from some of the other candidates onto Perdue, because it was, they sort of didn't have him on the radar per se, as much as they would have otherwise. But I thought, at that point, the big three offices, meaning both Senate seats and governor, were held by sort of former Republican congressmen. Mm-hmm. That was what they'd been electing. So my theory was basically, let's take a guy who's got some corporate record issues and see if we can make the case. That clearly in Georgia in 14 plus the year, we were going to have a circumstance where it was a little bit unusual that they picked a Democrat.
Right.
That it wasn't just sort of a standard Republican versus Democrat battle on the same issues they've been hearing about repeatedly. And my thought was Perdue might give us that opening, realizing the fact that he had this sort of outsider appeal and his, sort of everything from his physical appearance to the quality of his campaign made him, potentially a very tough opponent. I was sort of, let's go that route. Other people were like, we need to have Kingston or somebody who's got this congressional record that we can shoot at. But I think in the end, going after him on Medicare cuts, that type of thing, not that people are with the Democratic side of that argument, it's just they're this kind of baked into the market.
Gotcha.
Might be the way to put it.
Were you involved in the 2016 election cycle here in Georgia?
Not much. A few like local clients, but not a lot.
So if you were watching on election night, and the only counties you saw come in were Cobb County, Gwinnett County going for Hillary Clinton, the assumption would be that that Georgia was going to go for Hillary Clinton.
Oh yeah, I would presume.
Right.
Georgia would go for Hillary Clinton, and she'd get 350 plus electoral votes nationwide.
What happened here in Georgia, and more broadly as we're getting more of a nationalized electorate here in Georgia?
I mean, I think it is realignment. I mean, you tend to have people say, "Oh, this is a realigning election," when there's a big landslide.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true if the sort of pieces of the electorate fall out in the same order. It's just one candidate or one atmosphere was particularly. The atmosphere particularly favored one candidate or the other, and the sort of break point is further to the left or right than normal.
Right.
But that order of the electorate is the same. I think Trump has done in the Atlanta suburbs what we were seeking to do, for example, in the Nunn campaign, without we were unsuccessful in doing it then. And,
Right.
And you have this shifting. I mean, some of it is obviously there are different people living in the suburbs than there were 10, 15 years ago.
Sure,
That's part of it.
demographic change in those
that
areas.
is part of it. But there are actually people who are changing their positions.
And who are those people? What are the profile? What is the profile of, say, a Romney, Purdue voter, 2012, 2014, and a Clinton, Stacey Abrams voter in 16 and 18?
Higher education, much more likely to be female. High education levels are becoming indicators of improved democratic performance across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Lucy McBath is one of my clients, and that's one of the most educated districts in the country.
And that's the Georgia 6th.
Right, and that's a big piece of that. In fact, I think Galloway wrote a column on it sometime in the last 3 or 4 months. And that's part of what's happening there is a college-educated voter, particularly a woman, in those kind of areas, their cultural identifiers are shifting
Right.
in a way that it's not as issue-driven as, or it is issue-driven, but it's also sort of culturally driven. Trump is such a cultural phenomenon that folks like that are seeing the Trump phenomenon and saying, that's not where I am. I'm actually over here with these folks. And so that's a major part of it as well. We also had several clients in 18. We did some work for Sally Harrell, who beat Fran Miller.
Right.
Zara Karenchak, who I mentioned to you, who won the Schaefer seat. I mean, those places are moving relatively quickly, both demographic change-wise as well as there are people switching their viewpoint.
So I guess the flip side of that coin is that there is a countervailing demographic that is rushing more to the Republican side
Right.
In the Trump era, which would be more, I suppose, rural education levels, as you said,
Right.
as well. Is that what we've come to? Is sort of the suburbs now are the toss-up? Cities Democratic, rural areas Republican. Whoever can win.
Or suburbs Democratic and exurbs toss-up might be.
Forsyth County, Cherokee County, Bartow County.
I mean, Abrams and
Fayette.
Carolyn Bordeaux won a precinct in Forsyth, which was hard to believe.
Right.
But it's yes. I mean, essentially, and what's happening in this state is what will make a two-party competitive again. It'll look like Illinois. Well, you'll have a major metro area that is Democratic, overwhelmingly so, and the rest of the state's Republican.
Right, which I'm from Illinois originally.
Oh, really?
The 12th, right outside of Carbondale,
Oh, okay.
which ancestrally Democratic seat. With Glenn Pichard, Jerry Costello,
Right.
but with Mike Bost, the Democrats had a great candidate in Brendan Kelly from up around Belleville area, O'Fallon, St. Clair County, but even in 2018 was unable to get within really 4 or 5 points of
Right.
Mike Bost, which that's a historically pro-union area of the state, coal mines, laborers, operators unions, and so what's happening here in Georgia, what we see with the suburbs, in
Right.
Illinois 6 with the Sean Casten seat against Peter Roskam, it's the same thing that's happening. So
Right.
I guess it gets back to that nationalizing electorate.
It is. It's nationalizing, and it's also, I mean, we were talking earlier about Marshall and Barrow. It's hard to believe, now that those were sort of battleground seats that Democrats held on to for several cycles.
Right.
I mean, I had a conversation with some group in early 17 where they, were like, well, we looked at all the numbers and it looks like the 12th is your best target for 18, meaning the old Barrow seat, and the people here were like, no.
Is that Rick Allen's seat?
Who beat Barrow in 14.
Right.
And, those places are going away from us very rapidly, even if there's Democratic voting
Right.
history there. people that, I remember actually talking to people from Barrow, and he used to get less votes, raw votes, in the general in Jenkins County than he got in the primary, because everybody'd show up to vote for
The sheriff or
and what
whatnot.
have you, and then they turn around in the fall and vote
Right.
for the Republican. But those places are moving away.
Right.
North Fulton, Cobb, Gwinnett, also Forsyth, Barrow, Cherokee are moving towards us, and that's realignment. I mean, you just have people shifting around in
Right.
a way that, you had the realignment go against us in sort of 2002 to 16, 18
Sure.
in these rural areas, but now, you have a countervailing realignment.
But-
For the suburbs.
Right, and we can talk about that in a little bit, but the first real test of this theory of realignment and what the short and long-term effect of Donald Trump was going to be was in that 6th district in the special election,
Right.
with John Ossoff. Were you involved in?
I was not involved in that one.
But okay, so as an outsider, is that proof or confirmation of what we're talking about, that you had a changed electorate because of the president mixed with demographics that had been changing, and now with an open seat? Tom Price,
Right.
Very talented, very great fundraiser, good
Right.
campaigner, and you have a unknown Democrat. No offense to John Ossoff, he
Right.
did great things as a candidate,
Right.
but people didn't. He wasn't a known quantity going
Correct.
into that race. Is that proof of concept that the suburbs were going to be
It
competitive?
is. I mean, the fact that he came within 4 points in that
right,
runoff
yeah, 52-48 in the runoff.
is obviously a massive change from where it was in 14 and prior, or even 16 and prior. Although I think the guy who ran against Price was a complete sacrificial lamb, but
Right.
yes, I mean, it was clear that that's what was happening. I think in the McBath campaign, in the general, and in fact, you even had some national people say this. They still sort of had a little bit of a hangover. They didn't quite believe that could switch, and they didn't quite believe that and they felt burned by the district. But we ended up with a very good candidate. Usually candidate quality is a major factor in this. Plus, we had Handel's record to talk about in Congress, and the district is not where the National Republican Party is now. It just isn't.
Were you with the McBath campaign in the primary through?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that was a relatively hard-fought primary. Bobby Capel and
Kevin Abel made the
Abel,
runoff.
excuse
There's
me, yeah.
a third candidate besides McBath
Right.
in the race.
Well, I guess going into it, the conventional wisdom is the Georgia 7th was if you had to choose the 6th or the 7th, which was going to flip in 2018. Both were obviously toss-ups by the end. The 6th, the Democrats were able to flip. The 7th,
Came close.
400 votes.
400 votes. Yeah, something to that effect.
So,
And, I think the 6 might have been in a little bit better position early in the cycle. 7 is changing a lot more quickly. Now, the interesting
With
thing
Gwinnett.
is, yes, the interesting thing is, in that runoff, Barrow won the 6th for his Secretary of State runoff.
Right.
Even though he had won the 7th, he lost it by a significant margin in the runoff. So the 6th is
more an
performing.
engaged electorate.
It's more engaged. Some of it's the Ossoff phenomena, the leftover special sort of energy, the fact that was the focus
Organized.
of the entire country.
Yeah.
And we see that with
$31 million can
Right.
buy a lot of organization.
right in McBath. The McBath campaign has a lot of volunteers and that type of thing because there are a lot of engaged people there. Some of it is also the income level and the stability of the people who live there. You got a lot of people who've been there a long time.
Sure,
Moved
sure.
to Sandy Springs or Roswell or Marietta at some point. Several years ago, bought a house they're engaged. Gwinnett, I think, is driven a lot more by new people moving in, a lot of people that might be renting at this stage. They're going to be engaged in a general runoff, a little less so.
So it's more reliant on GOTV to actually drive them back to the polls.
I think in 2020 it's going to be very hard for the Republicans to hold that seat.
The 7th.
Yeah, in an open seat, plus a presidential turnout. I think that seat is, and the seat is moving so quickly, performance-wise, that I think it's going to be very, very tough for them to hold that.
I didn't ask this, but how much did Lucy McBath's campaign benefit from John Ossoff's unsuccessful effort?
I mean, it's certainly the level of engagement in that special election was helpful.
Right.
I mean, I was telling the candidate and others, we'd go to a runoff, primary runoff, debate at a church, and there'd be 500 people in the pews.
Which doesn't happen.
No, people usually don't care, right? You end up with the same 50 people at every one of those things. The same people go to county Democratic Party meetings. That type of thing. So you definitely had that. I mean, we ended up not talking about the same issues that vis-a-vis handle that Ossoff had used. We ended up talking more about handles congressional record issues and incumbent. And, our concern, obviously, an incumbent's harder to beat. She just got in there. People are going to be inclined to give her a chance. That said, we were able to show that she was very much part of the problem in Washington. So, that's why they ended up switching it out, because that's not where that district is. I mean, they're not in that kind of right-wing Republican mindset anymore, if they ever were.
The sort of post-Trump election Republican Party is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay. So when did you get involved in the governor's race? The 2018? Yes, 2018 governor's race. Now, let's not even think about the 2020 governor's race.
Right, 2022. Yeah.
Or 2022.
You're right. I guess in September, October of 17.
Of 17?
Yeah.
And did you manage Stacey Evans? You were a consultant on Stacey Evans' campaign. Was Stacey Abrams already in the race by the time you came on board?
I can't remember who got in first, but
Okay.
they both got in around sometime in the mid-spring of 17.
So tell me about your campaign's message, Stacey Evans' campaign message during the primary, what you were trying to do and how you were trying to differentiate your campaign from the, quote, other Stacey in the campaign.
I mean, obviously the big contrast was on the Hope Scholarship.
Sure.
And it's something Evans felt particularly strongly about personally, had a compelling bio that involved the Hope Scholarship, her ability to use it to go to UGA and ultimately go to law school was, a key part of her bio. So that was, a major focus of it, and they had a contrasting record on that based on the legislation that Governor Deal had put forward in 2011 on that. So that's where a lot of it focused from our side. Was, when it came to the contrast, that was really the bulk of the contrast.
Right.
The positive, was related to that was sort of education, college access, that type of thing.
So one of the critiques of the campaign, I guess, would have been that it was too hyper-focused on hope. Were there other areas of contrast, looking back, that may have helped, or was just one of those cycles where?
Maybe. Obviously, when you lose by a wide margin, you look back and you say, "Hey, maybe we should have,
done something
something different." That said, it's one of those moments where, you run a campaign that's, the candidate believes in, and that
you
is
run to your
accurate
strengths,
and
I suppose.
That type of thing, and you go from there. So.
So, looking back on the Republican side, the obvious candidate would have been Casey Cagle, the heir apparent
Right.
to the Deal legacy. Led in the primary, but held under 40,
Right.
which is not where you want to be as a front runner.
Not if you are that dominant.
Right, and then was wiped out in the runoff by Secretary of State Brian Kemp,
Right.
Athens native. So I guess the question that for years in the 90s and 2000s, you sort of had these dueling establishments, the Republican establishment, the Democratic establishment, sort of in the person of Roy Barnes and the Buddy Darden, the sort of centrist Democrat, the pro-growth, maybe don't rock the boat, conservative Republican.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to that in 2018?
Well, I think to your point on the nationalization of politics, I mean, if you looked at Cagle going into 18, I mean, he looked in some ways a lot like, the closest analogy I can think of was sort of Miller 90, where you get this longtime LG, the whole world's for him. He ends up with, significant opposition, ends up in a runoff. But in hindsight, you look back and it looks completely obvious that Miller was going to be governor that entire time. I'm sure for the people running the race or other races against him, it doesn't appear that way looking forward. But in hindsight, you sort of look at it and say, that's sort of what Cagle looked like. I think Trump's sort of power inside the Republican electorate, obviously, was a factor that, I think no one's really seen anything like that in sort of modern politics in this state, at least, where, a president can just sort of anoint somebody and that's it. I mean, look, if George H.W. Bush had, endorsed somebody in a primary, George W. Bush, it's a good thing.
Right.
But I don't think it's as definitive as the Kemp endorsement by Trump was. I mean, I think, Kemp may well have won that runoff. I mean, I think...
I think trending, the trend was clearly...
To your point, not breaking 40 if you're Cagle is concerning. But I think the flip side to it is it's not... if you're Cagle, and I guess the only thing you could have done is somehow, kept Trump out of it or gotten the endorsement yourself. And I don't know if there's any way for him to do that because, it was such a... the margin was amazing.
He did get he had Governor Deal's endorsement, which love him, hate him, his numbers
Popular
were
governor.
very, very good in a state that with an increasingly divided electorate.
Right.
Relatively strong support from Democrats, very strong support from independents and Republicans.
Right.
But clearly, to your point, the president's endorsement superseded a very popular governor's in Georgia.
Yeah, no, I think, the Trump hold on the Republican Party is something that's relatively unprecedented in anything, certainly since I've been doing politics. Presidents generally are liked by their party, not always.
Right.
But that kind of ability to anoint is pretty remarkable.
Looking at 2018, the general election, in 2014 there was some hope that on the Democratic side that Jason Carter was going to be able to keep it close, similar with your campaign with Michelle Nunn, but in those 6 weeks leading up to the campaign, the Republicans opened up a lead, not a huge lead, but an insurmountable, modest lead.
Right.
And that never happened in 2018. The polls remained close, showing Brian Kemp with probably a slight lead going into the polls. Why wasn't there that 2014, that 2010 widening, distancing by the Republican candidate? How were Democrats Stacey Abrams able to keep it so close?
Obviously, in all all cases you're dealing with sort of the overarching atmospherics are going to have an effect.
Right.
It was a great year to run as a Democrat. That said, look, I mean, they raised a huge amount. Abrams raised a huge amount of money. I thought some had some very effective advertisements. Turnout from core Democrats was good. It was good everywhere, but they certainly managed to have it be good here. It was a good race, and I think with a couple of different breaks, you end up with a Democratic governor in 18. You end up with Abrams as governor. I mean, I think it was just one of those circumstances where it's close enough that a variety of factors could have shifted it.
Yeah, looking back, I looked at some of the numbers for the Libertarian candidate, because the Libertarian candidate has been on the ballot since 1992, I believe. And these are never high numbers, but 2% and 3%.
Right.
Ted Metz, the Libertarian candidate, didn't break a single point. Setting aside maybe his particular personality or
Right.
what have you, he promised to drop out of the campaign if somebody would pay off debts or something
Right.
like. Setting that aside, is that evidence of a more energized, plugged-in electorate that 2% of people aren't willing to say, my vote matters this year? Is that what that means?
I think so. I mean, I think ultimately folks are less likely to sort of take a flyer and vote for Libertarian.
Right.
I don't think their particular status as a candidate really affects much. I mean, obviously, there are some hardcore Libertarians who probably know who they are and go out and vote for a Libertarian most of the time. But, the variable is not going to be based on their candidate quality. I mean, to your point, if you look at 14, my recollection is that the Libertarian in the governor's race got significantly more votes than the Libertarian in the Senate race. And I think some of that may be because it was obviously a nationalized race in the Senate race, and I think there's a sense that there's a lot on the line. And even though it was a governor's race in 18, because of Trump, because of the size of the spending, that type of thing, the attention on it, it was a very nationalized electorate, and I think people are more likely to think they need to take a side that could actually prevail, and they're less likely to sort of send a message by just voting for a candidate that's clearly going to be under 5% of the vote.
Right. So we've talked about this already a little bit, the suburban trend towards the Democrats, and we've talked about DeKalb went Democratic a long time ago. It used to be the epicenter of Republicanism in Georgia. Cobb, Gwinnett, Clayton, Douglas, Henry County. What's the next? If you're looking at which of those metro counties, north or south, or will fall to the Democratic or fall in the Democratic column next?
I'd probably go Forsyth and Fayette. Fayette.
So Peachtree City and
right.
And
now the interesting thing is that if you look at some of the districts in the north side of town, I mean, there's demographic change, but there tends to be also a little bit more a sense, if you look at the numbers, that Democratic performance among white voters is rising. If you look at the south side of town, it will be more just pure demographic change.
Right.
For example, if you look at some of the state Senate seats, like there's a couple state Senate seats and state House seats that have a lot of Henry in them, they will tend to, Democratic performance will more closely track the increase in minority voters in those districts, whereas in the northern tier, you'll see a little bit more. Obviously, there is demographic shifting that will affect the two-party vote, but you'll also see some. That doesn't account for all of
Right.
it. There'll be some people that are moving their votes. Otherwise, it wouldn't. There's not enough demographic shifting to account
Right.
for the entire movement.
So maybe this is a better question for maybe a Nikema Williams or somebody on the state party staff. But is this just hurry up and wait for demographics to be on your side, or is there something you can do organizationally, party building wise, to speed that process along in a Fayette County or a Forsyth County or a Cherokee County?
You can speed it. I think it's more probably message driven than it is organizationally. I mean, you can affect it by organization.
Sure.
But you're limited as to your resources, time and money, and person power to how much you can affect. I think the message contrast is going to set the atmospherics around
Right.
where people kind of identify and where they're inclined to go.
And looking at rural and small town voters, rural voters in Middle and South Georgia used to be the backbone of the Democratic Party, and there's an ongoing dialogue whether there's something Democrats can do to win back rural voters and small town voters. Is that possible in the current political environment that we've seen in 16 and 18?
I think it is possible to do better than we've done.
Gotcha.
Which obviously makes a huge difference statewide. I mean, I don't think you're going to start winning a bunch of legislative seats or congressional seats in rural South Georgia.
But
or
it's
rural
possible
North Georgia, but it's
to cut the margin of
cut the margin.
loss.
That if that happens, then you end up with a Democratic governor or a
Sure.
Democratic senator, and I think that is possible to do. Where Trump is going on the trade piece is an interesting question. Whether that ultimately overwhelms the sort of cultural markers that have people moving towards Trump in those kinds of places around the country. I don't know. I mean, there's some speculation as to that. How deep and that goes numerically, vote-wise, I don't know. I do think in those places, to your point on organization, there is still work to be done with base Democratic voters in those parts of the state. It tends to be harder to organize there because people are more spread out.
It's hard to walk and knock
Right,
in,
and culturally,
rural areas.
I think it's it's harder to sort of send people into a rural county to talk to anybody, black, white, any other ethnicity. But that's if you look at where there's still some ground to be made. Those are places you could do it. Maybe even more than Metro as far as
Right.
percentage. Now the number of people, the actual number of votes may be less because there's less people. But
Right.
But there is work to be done in those places.
We've been talking about how close Stacey Abrams got to becoming governor, but down ballot, there wasn't much difference between Stacey Abrams at the top of the ballot and education, Secretary of Education at the bottom. What accounts for the lack of ticket splitting up and down the ballot? Because we were talking about Thurber Baker winning in 2006.
Right.
Totally different dynamic in 2018.
Yeah. I mean, some of it is, I think open seats tend to follow a little bit more the top of the ticket. But, there is some. I mean, Charlie Bailey, who ran for Attorney General, was one of my clients. And, he ended up doing, I think, down ballot wise, as well or better than anybody. He and Barrow are sort of the two. And obviously, you account for ballot drop-off, which people who just vote for the top of the ticket and leave, which tends to be a little bit worse on our side than on the Republican side still. There is a little bit of ticket splitting, not a ton, but there is some. And if you overlay people, their votes aren't identical.
Right.
But, I think when you have an open seat, particularly in down ballot races, it can be a little bit harder to have the resources to cut a massively different profile than what people presume you are based on your partisan affiliation. I think that's a lot of it, but there's probably a little bit more ticket splitting than people tend to think.
Right.
There are people that will jump around a little bit. So,
since you got involved in politics, it advanced in-person voting. Mm-hmm. How has that changed the way campaigns are run and how you allocate your resources?
Well, you definitely need to account for it now, particularly with mail and digital, targeted communication. There tend to be people that will vote early every time, mm-hmm. Or you can presume that they're more likely to be an early voter based on other indicators. They're modeling that type of thing. And you should try to talk to them before they go cast a ballot, particularly if you're in a primary. I think sometimes in a general, somebody's going to sort of show up at the very beginning of early voting. In particular, is probably not particularly persuadable two-party wise, mm-hmm. but in a primary, you certainly need to account for it since it's wide open. So it does change it. It does change it. It also makes it a little bit easier to do actual sort of pushing people to the polls who might not otherwise vote, because you don't just have a 12-hour period to
right.
get them to actually execute the act of voting. You have some other ways to do it, whether that's vote by mail or in person early.
Right. So one of the topics that was discussed at length and has persisted since the election is the issue of voter suppression, or
mm-hmm.
Is there a way to actually gauge, or accurately gauge rather, the impact of so-called voter suppression here in Georgia, or is that just something that campaigns have to be cognizant of historical issues in particular counties and precincts?
Yeah, I think it's hard to put a number
sure.
on what for example, voter ID. How many people never even entertain the thought of voting because they don't have an ID and don't want to get mm-hmm. one, or don't have the ability to get one, or if the registration process is more arduous than it ought to be and they never even start, or they do part of it and don't respond to a letter or drop out, mm-hmm. or the process for some other reason. It's hard to put a numeric value on that. I think there is an impact, particularly in states like Georgia. I think there is a reason, obviously, that the Republican Party is doing this kind of stuff. They're not, they are willing to do what they need to do to give themselves every advantage. So yes, I think there is an impact on that, and Abrams is correct, and others are correct that the act of voting obviously need to be secure. You need to know that there's not fraud, but when you start sort of throwing up roadblocks to it, it's a problem that needs to be dealt with.
Well, looking ahead to 2020, David Perdue is up for re-election. His campaign has already started up. The Democratic primary's heating up today. Another candidate, Sarah mm-hmm. Riggs-Amico, just jumped in, just to date this for future reference. But how big of a target electorally is David Perdue?
I think a lot of it depends on the atmospherics.
Sure.
I think
and this is a presidential election
right.
year too, which
right.
is different from his mm-hmm. first election campaign.
Yeah, I think if Trump is in trouble, which there would seem to be indications that he will be, even if the economy stays reasonably good. Perdue has really lashed himself to Trump in a way that I think even some Republicans find surprising. It's obviously a massive contrast between him and Isaacson. Mm-hmm. Isaacson still has a very conservative voting record, but sort of the way he talks, how he responds to things that Trump says and does is completely different than Perdue. I think if the Democratic nominee for president wins Georgia, I think he's got a problem. There could be an issue where, he can force a runoff, and then he's favored in the runoff.
Sort of the Saxby-Chambliss,
Right,
Jim Martin.
Saxby-Chambliss, Jim Martin, Fowler, Coverdale. You end up that kind of scenario. But I would not want to be David Perdue if Trump does not win Georgia, and that certainly seems to be a real possibility. I mean, even if in a very competitive close election, Georgia would still go Republican. You may not have a competitive close election. I mean, there's some reason to believe, based on polling and everything else, that the national electorate is just going to be exhausted of Trump and looking to do something else. And if the Democratic nominee is an acceptable alternative, they will do that.
So you think 2018, that polling, that the demographics make Georgia, the always talked about a purple state, a competitive swing state, but 2020 is actually a year where it could very well be that swing state.
It could be, and I mean, it's interesting when you look at how these things sort of emerge. I mean, I actually remember we were talking, first paid campaign job I had in Clinton '96. I mean, people thought Florida was a waste of time at the beginning of that cycle, and Clinton himself was actually very focused on it. Like he thought he could have won it in '92, didn't put any money in there, really wanted to do it. I know there was a big internal debate about whether to do it, and it became clear that places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan were in the bag. They started shifting money down there. My girlfriend at the time was in the Florida campaign in Fort Myers, and they ended up with tons of attention and money. It can move very quickly. And, I think Georgia's probably sort of on the cusp of that. I also think it's probably in better shape than Texas, ultimately. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Texas, but I think Georgia demographically and culturally is going to be a little bit easier nut to crack for the Democratic nominee than Texas. It's also cheaper, way cheaper.
Right.
It's easier to take a flyer on Georgia than it is on Texas.
And is that because of just how expensive you've got Dallas Metroplex, Houston,
San Antonio,
Austin.
I mean, there's like 27 media markets in Texas, so it's a lot. And some big ones.
Right. So something I always ask somebody or interviewees is how were Democrats able to hold on to power in Georgia for so long? We're talking 18. We won't get into the 1800s and 1900s of the county unit system and Jim Crow, obviously. But how were Democrats able to hold on to power so long during that period of increasing competitiveness in the mid to late 20th century?
I mean, I think a couple things. I think actually the decision in the 60s, the sort of Sanders versus Wallace kind of decision probably helped in the sense that, it moderated the electorate a little bit. Because, I mean, politicians are they respond to what the market wants, but they also shape the market at some level. And I think, that helped. The Carter presidency, I think, probably helped. The fact that he won it both times, even though he was from here, the fact that there were, Carter people around who were pretty sophisticated people, probably helped in the 80s and in 90s. I think we also just ended up with luck of the draw, some very talented politicians in the 80s and 90s particularly, which matters. Guy Milner was a help, to be honest. I mean, I think he had some particular vulnerabilities as a candidate. He probably could have won that 94 race. Miller was really good, and Milner made some errors. 96, I think he'd probably already the roadmap was there, and then '98 he was sort of a spent force. And
Right.
I think that helped. Murphy helped. He was sort of a master coalition.
And this is Tom Murphy, Speaker Murphy.
Right. Master coalition maintainer. He had a unique ability to keep a lot of different disparate types of people in the tent. And I think, all of that probably added up to, some of it luck, some of it skill. And you also have circumstances where, like if you look at North Carolina, I think they were probably hurt in the 80s and 90s by having their statewide elections on the presidential year.
Oh, right.
They've actually been helped by that now. I think Roy Cooper was helped in 16 by the fact
sure.
that he was running. I mean, obviously McCrory had his own vulnerabilities, but I think
It's still very close race.
But I think Cooper, he had some advantages there. I actually had some involvement in the Bev Perdue versus McCrory race in 2008. And, I think Perdue was helped by the fact that Obama was winning the state that year, obviously. So some of it can be that, 10 and 14 were tough years for us. And, 90 and 92, we lost the Senate seat, but 96 was a good Democratic year. 98 was a great Democratic year. We got a little bit of luck on our side at that point. But I think that's a lot of it. I think, but I do think the fact that the state establishment made the decision and had the power to implement it to sort of not go down this sort of Alabama path probably helped somewhat.
Yeah. Speaking of that, not so long ago we had here in Georgia candidates and elected officials who made a point of calling themselves Georgia Democrats. A distinct uncoupling from the National Democratic Party of your early race, like Michael Dukakis, for example.
Right.
Do those labels, National Democrat versus Georgia Democrat, mean anything in 2018?
No.
That's a relic of a bygone era
and
in politics.
If that meant anything into the 20th century or 21st century, it certainly didn't mean anything past 2002. I mean, I think to our point previously, I think 2003 forward was actually sort of the building of the Democratic Party more than it was the rebuilding of it, because it was just a different enterprise.
Right.
After that election.
Do you think there will be any effort on Georgia Republicans, perhaps, maybe those who still remain in suburban and metropolitan electorates, to try to distance themselves from the president or the Republican Party that the president represents? Or is that something that in this environment, in this electorate, this day and age, is more difficult than it was, say, in the 60s or 70s or 80s?
I think it's tough to do, and
Right.
I think it's also tough to do when Kemp is governor. I think, the HB 41 bill, and apparently they're coming back with some other, this is the heartbeat bill.
Right,
they're coming
right,
back with
right.
other similar things. Their theory is the way they win legislative seats and Kemp gets reelected is to please the base.
So base cohesion.
And I think, look, there's some reason to believe. Look, he clearly turned out, if you look at the margins in 18, he clearly turned out, both numerically and margin-wise, a Republican base in this non-metro Atlanta counties.
Right.
That's undeniable. Some of the size of the electorate and the margins are pretty amazing. But I think if you're in North Fulton or Gwinnett or Cobb or Henry or one of these places, it's that's tough. I think in some ways you're getting left behind by the party as a whole, and I think if they're going to go that route, I think it's going to be hard to decouple.
Right, and 4 years on, I suppose the argument would go, the growth in your Gwinnett's and Cobb's, your metro core,
Right.
is going to far outstrip any sort of growth that you would see in non-metro, especially in South Georgia, where you have no and negative growth in some counties.
They have two problems. One is, the Republicans, they have two problems. One is what you said, growth, where the growth is. It tends to be in these metro counties. The stuff that used to go against us. I remember Dave Beatty, who was Barnes's pollster, did a presentation to the party caucuses when I was at the party, talking about sort of exurban Atlanta's growth and how that basically tracked where Barnes. It ended up not exactly being the case because he also had these massive losses in South Georgia, Ware County. But there was, you could look at where these folks were moving in these exurban areas and how those performance changed, and that was really a huge part of the deficit, not all of it.
Right.
That has flipped, and where the growth is now is more Democratic. So you have that, you're going to have seats shifting into areas that are becoming more Democratic. The other problem they have is if you look at these legislative seats in particular, for example, there's not a lot of legislative seats that Democrats hold in places where you say, how do we have that or how do we hold that? I mean, in 2004, I remember Robert Ray who was a legislator from sort of outside of Macon. We polled that, and he was running for re-election, and Bush had an 80% job approval rating. It was
it's a tough row to hoe, as they say.
And it's just like, how do you either get the guy reelected or convince him he should stay a Democrat? And there were tons of those seats. Now you don't look at a particularly large number of seats and say, wow, how do we have that one? And the ones that where you're nervous about tend to be ones that they just flipped and they're heading our way. So 2 years in a presidential and then 2 years beyond that in another gubernatorial, they're going to be better than they are now. And I think that's sort of, not sort of, it is their problem in the sense that there's not a lot of upside growth in the current shakeout of the map and the electorate for the Republicans.
Right. So one of the closest races, or the most marginal seats, would be probably Bob Trammell's, who's House Minority Leader, his Coweta-based seat. But yeah, like you said, East Cobb, the greater Athens area with Houston Gaines and Marcus Wiedauer in Watkinsville.
Right.
You, looking at it as a Democratic consultant, would say I would be much more concerned if I was a Republican holding those seats than Democrats in newly won or newly flipped seats.
Right.
Is that because 2020 is a presidential election year and that Democrats tend to perform better in
that's certainly
presidential
2020 presidential years are going to be better for us. And presidential years tend to be better for the party where the state is heading. It used to be the presidential years were worse for us.
I
can remember in the
Mack
80s
Mattingly,
and 90s, it was like, oh God, it's a presidential year. Good thing the governor's race is in the off year. When,
the 84.
When the old people vote, because they're all with us. That's the old, coalition. But it's the opposite now. And Trammell's seat, for example, but even that seat is way better in a presidential year than it is in an off year. So, that's a competitive seat. There are a few other ones. Some of the ones in North Fulton are still competitive.
Sure.
But they're getting better for us, not worse. And I think that's really where you got a problem if you're a Republican. It's just like, it's not, you look at the map and you're not like, oh, here's 5 seats that are obviously just ripe for us to go take, or 10 seats, or even more than that back in the day. I think they have a problem in that the population growth, the seat shifting, as well as where there are flippable seats are not their seats.
Right, and we're
to pick up.
Yeah, and we're several months out still from qualifying, so some of these seats, competitive seats, could very well be open seats by the time April rolls around.
In politics, trends tend to reinforce themselves. If a party's on the rise, the other parties, incumbents start to say this isn't worth.
And you've seen that in the U.S. House of Representatives, for example.
Right, and we saw it on our side, and 2000s. It was, I'm just not going through this. It's a long shot.
Right.
And it's not worth the effort and the emotional drain to try to hold this thing. I'm giving it up or I'm switching.
Right. I think I was talking to Galloway, Jim Galloway, and he said if he were trying to pick a sleeper race that may not be on somebody's radar, it would be Barry Loudermilk's district, which is Bartow, Cobb, and
Goes into Buckhead.
Essentially Buckhead carved out for him. That demographics and turnout might sneak up on an incumbent like that.
Right.
Is that possible? Probable?
It's possible. It's probably not in 20.
Okay.
But it's possible, and it could end up being closer. I mean,
and of course, we'll have a round of redistricting.
Right. And I think the problem they've
22.
got in redistricting, look, going into 11 after the 10 census, they were ascendant. It was easy to, relatively speaking, to get their members, whether they're members of Congress or members of the General Assembly, to say, okay, we're going to take your seat down a little bit so that we can get 2 seats next to it in better shape. If you're a member of the General Assembly, a Republican member of the General Assembly, and a guy who sat next to you just got beat or quit because he thought he was going to get beat, it gets a lot harder to say, hey, give me those 3 good precincts and put them over here so that we can have 2 seats instead of 1. You're like, no, wait a second. If you're Loudermilk, you're down at the Capitol saying, I want Buckhead out of my seat.
Right.
Get it out of here. And at that point, what do you do with that? There's a lot of people there. It's now Democratic. What do you do with that if you're the Republican leadership, if they're still in complete control of redistricting, which hopefully they won't be. But if they are, where do you put Buckhead? Where do you put North Fulton? What do you do with Cobb and Gwinnett? Loudermilk's not going to want it. Tom Graves isn't going to want it. These guys aren't going to want that stuff in their seats because they've seen movement. 6 will have switched. 7th, I think, is highly likely to switch. It's at that point, it's like, what do you do with that stuff? And you run out of places to stick it.
Right. So you're saying if Republicans do remain in control of the redistricting process, likely, possibly not, but likely they are, it's a much harder map to draw than 2011.
Yeah, it's the population shifts and the partisanship of the electorate are harder for them, but the attitudes of the members are going to be completely different.
I see.
They're going to want to control the process in a way that's much more self-interested, and it's going to be much harder to get them to say, "Hey, I'm willing to give up some Republican voters so that we can help a seat next door." They're much more likely to be in pure self-preservation mode.
Well, since the nature of your business, I won't ask too much about the upcoming election cycle. So we'll just end it there, I think.
Okay.
Jeff, thank you very much on behalf of the Russell Library.
Somewhat interesting.
Absolutely. Everyone is interesting in their own way.
Okay, I guess that's a good thing.
Thank you very much, sir.
So cool.